Hello there. So, I want to talk about stereo guitars. This is something that I've happened to become very passionate about, kind of unbeknownst to myself. Ever since I heard about it, I was interested in it. And ever since I pursued it and started doing it, I've been really impressed with the results, and I would like to pass that on to you. So, I am going to make a case for why you should use a stereo guitar instead of a mono guitar if you can. This video is going to be a lot of talking and then some noise so you can actually hear the differences in some of the different things I'm talking about. We'll talk about some methods of going stereo. We'll talk about what stereo is. So there's going to be a lot of talking. So if you don't want to hear talking, this is probably not the video for you. But understanding why and how something works really matters, especially in terms of like if you're in a position where you're trying to get buy-in from somebody else to fund something like this, that matters. And it's just interesting. You tend to work better when you understand how something works, or at least I do. So lots of talking first. And sorry for the visual. I didn't know what else to show other than a stereo pedal. So I got my a lovely shot of the back end of my Big Sky all full of cables here, and I'll explain that briefly in a second. So that's what you're going to look at the whole time, and occasionally a hand gesture or thumbs up or something. So anyway, let's start super basic. Let's start with asking, what is stereo? Well, a stereo guitar is the opposite of a mono guitar. I'm just kidding, but seriously, kind of. So a mono guitar is when you take your guitar, you run it probably through your pedal board or something, you run it out to an amp, and then in a live sound context, that amp gets mic'd and it gets put on one channel on the board so people can control it. And odds are most of your live environments have two sets, at least two speakers, some on either side. And so that same signal is then sent to both sides of the room. And I should stop at this point and say that if the system you're playing through is not a stereo system, then you wouldn't want to bother because it won't make any difference. And unless you're using in-ears, but that's a whole other thing. So you might say, okay, so how do I know if my system's stereo? Well, the answer is if your soundboard can pan things, both sides, and panning just means sending sound to one of the two sides, the left or the right, or some combination. If your board can do that, and I mean by board, I mean your front of house soundboard in your live sound context. If it can do that, then you have a stereo system. And so a lot of times sound engineers will use it to widen things out. Like they might put, if you're running two guitars in general on a stage or a bunch of different instruments, they might put some like a little more to the left or to the right. It just opens things up and makes things louder, or not louder, I'm sorry. It just opens things up and makes things seem wider, and you'll see that that is consistent here as well. So that's basically, so in the case of, that's mono, all that just to get to what mono is. So in the case of stereo, what you're doing with a guitar is you're going out to two different amps instead, and those are going to two different board channels, and then they're getting panned. And we'll explain that in a minute. But I did a video once before that ran through kind of how to do stereo, and basically all you really need to do that, you obviously need a second amp in some way, and we'll touch on why that matters later as well. But basically all you need is a stereo effect pedal like this one that has two outputs. It has a left and a right output. A lot of them will accept stereo inputs as well, but that doesn't matter. Like if this was the only stereo pedal on my board, this pedal, whatever I'm trying to say, this patch cable wouldn't be here. You would come in mono and you'd go out stereo. So instead of your 1/4 inch cable going straight to one amp or going to, your SGI or whatever, you've got a cable going to each of 2 amps or 2 SGIs or whatever you're using to get back there. So that's basically what it means to run in stereo. So the next question is, why run in stereo? What's the point? Why would you do it? Well, I'll give you 3 reasons. Number 1 is the sound is wider. Everything just sounds bigger and larger and fuller. And the reason for that is that your ears are designed to hear sound as multidimensional images. And so what stereo does with a guitar, at least we'll just leave it in the context of guitars, is it does a better job of painting that picture than a mono guitar is. And the reason is because you're sending different information to each side of the house in this case. And so different sides of your ears in life. And so it just more matches, like your ears are going to perceive different things because there's one on each side of your head. And so it's going to hear things slightly differently if they're different on either side, if that makes sense. So small variations your ears can pick up on, and that's what stereo guitar aims to do. Number two is that a bunch of effects pedals are designed to take advantage of stereo. Right now, it's mostly reverbs and delays, but I don't think it'll be long, and I would be excited to think that some pedal makers will start to take advantage of stereo and take it beyond just reverbs and delays. There may be some stereo tremolos out there. I bet that there are. But I'll be excited when some pedal manufacturers will take advantage of that and put it to apply it to other effects. Like that'll just be really exciting, at least for somebody like me. But anyway, what those pedals are designed to do, they're designed with stereo in mind, and so they send slightly different information to either side of both the left and the right outs. And so, like, you may have heard a delay that ping-pongs back and forth between each side of the house, and that's done with a stereo delay, like, say, your timeline or your time factor or something like that. There's probably others that do it, but it's all about sending different information to each side, and that's what makes stereo work. That's what paints that multi-dimensional image better, because then each side of your head is hearing something slightly different, and it just sounds bigger and fuller. And number three is it's not as expensive to go stereo as you might think. And now the first obvious hurdle to that is, well, I have to buy a whole second amp, and it has to not suck. Well, both of those things are true. You do need another amp, and ideally it would not be a crappy amp. But if you play in, say, a church context like I do, and let's face it, church is probably the most likely place that you will be able to go stereo pretty easily. But anyway, a lot of churches will provide pretty decent house amps for their guitar players, because a lot of guitar players at churches are volunteers, and sometimes or a lot of churches have a high production value and they want a certain level of gear on their back line or whatever. So a lot of times there's already an amp available for a guitarist to use. And so most guitarists have their own amp anyway, and it would be just fine to you're probably going to bring your amp along anyway. And so you can just pair it with the amp that's there, and then all of a sudden you've eliminated pretty much the entire cost of running stereo. The only other costs that are involved is like cabling. I mean, you might need like one other cable. The only time it really incurs any kind of cost is if you're running like SGIs or something, and you would need to buy a second SGI. But that price for this much of a difference in improved sound, like to me at least, is worth it. You might not find it worth it, but that's the reason for this video, is you judge for yourself. So those are the three reasons why you would go stereo. So let's talk about a couple different ways that you might do it. So you might say, okay, so what if I just have if you know anything about front of house, you might say, okay, well, what if I just have my sound guy, what if I don't buy a second amp and all that crap? What if I just have my sound guy split the signal coming out of my pedal board and send it to two different board inputs and just panning each input to either side of the house? And the answer there is that it's the same thing as running mono. Your ears would hear the exact same thing, because he's sending the exact same information to two different sides of the house. And so what you're going to hear is that same image as if you would have plugged in mono. It's the same thing. And then there's another method that you can do on a lot of boards where you can kind of fake stereo. So like you're sending one signal out to your board, and then the person at the front of house duplicates that and delays one side a little bit. And so you can do that. A lot of boards have software built in that can delay a channel, but it does fake kind of the same notion, like because one signal is just ever so slightly behind the other signal, it's going to sound a little bigger and wider than just a normal mono signal would. So for example, I'll show you what that would sound like to do that. So a mono signal would sound like this. And then if we duplicate that channel and then we put a little delay on, then you'll get a slightly delayed effect. And this is in software that we're doing this. So you can see how it gets wider sounding. And so that's kind of the first step. And so you can do that, and then you don't have to buy two amps. That's true. But the things that you'll miss is that you won't get to take advantage of the different tones that two different amps provide, which we'll touch on a little bit later in a second. And you won't get to take advantage of the space and the space and width that a stereo guitar effect pedal will give you. And so it's not ideal. So another method would be that I've actually seen or heard of before is you say, well, what if we just double mic my guitar amp if we just mic it twice. So that's two signals going to two different board inputs at your front of house, and they can pan it to each side, and you'll be sending different information to each side. That is true. And if you change mics, then it's even more pronounced. Like if you add a different mic, let's say you got a 57 on one, and then you got like a ribbon or a different condenser on the other side of your mic. You could also, one could be closer to the center of your amp and closer to the edge, so you get kind of brighter, darker. So there you are sort of faking what you would get with two different amps, because if you're using two different mics that are EQ'd differently, you're going to get different EQ on each side of your house, which is going to create a lot of width. But this is better, but you're also missing out on what your guitar pedals can do when they're in stereo. So you won't get any kind of ping pongs or any kind of modulation moving around, or it depends on the pedal, but they can do a lot that way. So the best way to do it is to have two amps. And that lets you take advantage of everything. It lets you take advantage of two different tones of amps, and one amp is going to either side of the house. It lets you take advantage of different EQs of amps and of mics. You could put a different mic on each amp, which pronounces the effect even more. And then you also get to take advantage of the width added by your stereo guitar pedals as well. So this is the preferred method, and the reason is because you are sending the most different information to each side of the house. And just to go over what happens at front of house again, you're sending them two different signals, and they are going to pan each one of those all the way to one side and the other. So one of your amps is going to only be on the left side of the house, and one of your amps is only going to be in the right side. But when you play through them, they're going to play together, and so it'll be through both sides, but you're going to have that different information on both sides, and people's ears are going to be going crazy with all the dimensions that you'll create. So finally, enough talking. Let's go on to where we can hear the difference created in a mono guitar and a stereo guitar. So we're going to do it dry first, and then we're going to do it with effects. So the amp setup right now that I have right now, on the one side I have the Morgan RCA 35. That's going to be in your, we're going to start with that one when we're running mono, just because that's the amp I'm familiar with and whatever. There's an SM57 on that. When we go stereo, that'll be on your left side. The right side is a Port City Pearl combo amp, which is... that's going to be on your right side. I have a Cascade Fathead mic on that one instead, so it's sending a little bit of different information there. The only part that's not ideal is these amps are similarly voiced. They're both clean and they're both kind of Fendery. The Morgan has KT66s in it right now, and the Port City has 6L6s. And so they're both clean and Fendery, so they're both bigger tubes. If you were to have the other amp be, say, like a more Voxy type amp, like something with like EL84s in there, you might notice even more of a difference EQ wise. But again, that's just to taste at that point. It's not strictly better to have differently voiced amps. Like if amps sound good, then in mono, they're going to sound good in stereo. That's kind of the way it goes. So let me let you listen. So this is what this is a mono guitar. We're not going to do any effects yet. It's a mono guitar coming out of the Morgan RCA 35, and you got, I'm playing a Telecaster. It's a Nash T57 Telecaster. So here's mono coming out of the Morgan. Sounds like this. All right, let's go stereo with no effects. Definitely hear the difference. Let's move on to some reverb, shall we? Let's add in some reverb on the Big Sky here. So let's go mono with reverb. Let that tail off for a second. So now let's go stereo on the Big Sky. So we'll let that tail off so you can see the difference. All right, let's look at the timeline. Let's hear the timeline in mono. And then let's hear the timeline in stereo. You can hear the added dimensions that there is. Like, first you kind of hear the difference in EQ and voicings between different mics and different amps by themselves, and then you hear what happens when you add effects on top of that. It just adds a ton of space. In my opinion, this is really ideal for a situation where if you've got one guitarist in a band, which happens a lot of times, like one electric guitarist, there's really almost no reason not to go stereo. Most places are set up to use two guitarists anyway, sometimes even more. And having that one guitarist go stereo will help him a ton in terms of filling out space, especially if you have stereo effects as well. So let's combine the timeline and the Big Sky in stereo, because why not? So there you go. Hopefully that is helpful and lets you understand what stereo is and why it works and how it works and all that stuff. Long video, but there you go. Like I said, for me, explaining, knowing why something works helps a ton in terms of deciding whether or not you're going to do it and all that stuff. So if you have questions, I love answering questions about this stuff. I don't know everything, but I have explored it a fair bit. So if you have questions, feel free to leave those in the comments, and I'm happy to answer them. So that's it. Bye-bye.